become quickly. So particularly today, because of Queen holiday, the staff of Delhi government has specially come for this program, and they do very wonderful. And our own students really just by. I asked so many students to come over, but really they don't walk even outside. So तो हम शुरू कर रहे हैं पहले प्रोफेसर को दिल्ली का की तरफ से now so now we begin the little audience, very good audience, well it did be very good audience. So first of all, Sanjay Gandhi, Director of the Affairs, he will welcome guests.
नमस्कार सर, आज शहीद आजम भगत सिंह के जन्म दिवस पर भगत सिंह आर्काइव्स एंड रिसोर्स सेंटर द्वारा आयोजित शहीद भगत सिंह के ऊपर आयोजित लेक्चर में मैं आपका अभिनंदन करता हूँ, वंदन करता हूँ। भगत सिंह भारत के इतिहास की वो शख्सियत है जिसका शब्दों में वर्णन करना बड़ा मुश्किल काम है। दिल्ली का भगत सिंह के क्रांतिकारी जीवन से बड़ा गहरा रिश्ता रहा है। सर्वप्रथम भगत सिंह दिल्ली में वर्ष 1923 में गणेश शंकर विद्यार्थी के अखबार प्रताप की ओर से दिल्ली के सांप्रदायिक दंगे को कवर करने आए थे तथा सीताराम बाजार की एक धर्मशाला में उन्होंने अपना ठिकाना बनाया था। वर्ष 1929 में शहीद भगत सिंह दिल्ली में फिर आते हैं तथा 8 अप्रैल 1929 को केंद्रीय असेंबली में बटुकेश्वर दत्त व अन्य साथियों के साथ बम फेंकते हैं। बम फेंकने से पूर्व भगत सिंह व उनके साथी कश्मीरी गेट इलाके में ठहरे हुए थे तथा वो कश्मीरी गेट से लाल किला, दरियागंज और तनावदेश होते हुए संसद भवन जो सेंट्रल असेंबली थी वहां पहुंचे थे। 4 अप्रैल 1929 को कश्मीरी गेट के रामनाथ स्टूडियो में वो बटुकेश्वर दत्त के साथ फोटो खिंचवाते हैं। उनका हेड वाला फोटो यहीं पर खींचा गया था। इसके अलावा कुदसिया गार्डन, फिरोजा कोटला, वाइसरीगल लॉज, ये भी सभी स्थान भगत सिंह से किसी न किसी तरह से जुड़े हुए हैं। आजादी के आंदोलन की समर्पित 2 ऐसी शख्सियत है जिन्होंने आम जन पर अपनी गहरी छाप छोड़ी, एक भगत सिंह और दूसरे गांधी जी। एक मैं आपको दिल्ली आर्काइव्स के रिकॉर्ड के आधार पर एक उदाहरण देना चाहता हूँ कि हमारे यहाँ पे एक एलबी हाई स्कूल है गोल मार्केट के अंदर। उस स्कूल के बच्चे 1923 के अंदर अपने बटन में भगत सिंह की फोटो लगाकर स्कूल में प्रवेश करते सारे बच्चे। ये रिकॉर्डेड है हमारे पास, एसएसपी की रिपोर्ट है, उसमें एसएसपी कंप्लेन कर रहे हैं स्कूल के प्रिंसिपल से कि आपके बच्चे जो है बटन अपने जो स्कूल के अंदर बटन में और भगत सिंह की फोटो लगा के आ रहे हैं। इसी तरीके का मैं दूसरा उदाहरण जो है आपको देना चाहता हूँ गांधी जी के बारे में। शाहिद अमीन ने एक आर्टिकल लिखा है गांधी एज महात्मा। इसमें वो एक जिक्र करते हैं कि एक बार गांधी जी का गोरखपुर में विजिट होना था, तो उससे पहले आप ये देखो ना, उसमें ना सोशल मीडिया है, ना मीडिया है, ना न्यूज प्रिंट मीडिया भी उतना ज्यादा एग्रेसिव नहीं है। तो उस समय गांधी जी की इमेजिनेटरी फिगर, उनका फोटो अपने अपने लोग वैसे बना रहे हैं कि यार गांधी जी ने लुंगी पहनी हुई है, धोती पहनी हुई है, नंगे बदन है। तो आज के जमाने के अंदर जब एक छोटी से छोटी चीज सोशल मीडिया और अन्य माध्यमों से पब्लिक के साथ कनेक्ट करती है, और उस समय जबकि इस तरीके की कोई भी सोशल मीडिया नहीं थी, ना इतना ज्यादा प्रेस एक्टिव था, पर उस समय भी इन दोनों जनों की शख्सियत इतनी विशाल थी कि मेरे ख्याल से शायद ही भारत के इतिहास में किसी और अन्य शख्स की होगी कि जिसको लोग नाम से जानते हैं और उसकी इमेजिनेटरी फिगर अपने दिमाग में फंसा के रखी हुई थी। तो इस शानदार कार्यक्रम के लिए मैं जेएनयू के प्रोफेसर डॉक्टर सुरेंद्र जी का हार्दिक अभिनंदन करता हूँ कि उन्होंने अपने इस कार्यक्रम में भाग लेने की सहमति दी है। मैं अपने भगत सिंह आर्काइव्स एंड रिसोर्स सेंटर के ऑनरी एडवाइजर प्रोफेसर चमनलाल जी, हमारी कमेटी के मेंबर अमर फरूक के साथ इन दोनों का भी इस्तेमाल करता हूँ। मैं अपने सभी साथियों का धन्यवाद करता हूँ कि इन्होंने सभी ने मिलकर इस शानदार कार्यक्रम का आयोजन किया। धन्यवाद।
सुरेंद्र जी, आज हम लोगों ने जिस चीज के ऊपर चर्चा रखी है, आमतौर पे कभी किसी यूनिवर्सिटी में या इंस्टीट्यूशन में इस तरह की चर्चा नहीं होती। इसलिए भी इसलिए रखी है कि ये एक नई फॉर्मेट हुई है जो वेस्ट से लेकर इंडिया तक पहुंची हुई है, क्योंकि इससे पहले वो फॉर्मेट थी, इसलिए कि लोगों ने जानबूझकर चर्चा की, फॉर्मेट ही नहीं थी। और हमें खुशी है कि हमारे भी डॉक्टर सूर्य जी हैं जिन्होंने ग्राफिक कार्ड क्या होता है, क्योंकि भगत सिंह पे एक नावल के ये जो ये इसके ऊपर चर्चा करेंगे, इसकी चित्र यहाँ पे लगा हुआ है। और वो क्या लिखा है, वो कैसे अलग चीज है। भगत सिंह के ऊपर बहुत सारे नावल लिखे गए हैं, बहुत सारी कविताएं लिखी गई हैं, बहुत सारी कहानियां लिखी गई हैं, बहुत सारी बायोग्राफी लिखी गई हैं, हर तरह की क्रिएटिव नाटक बहुत सारे, उसका भंडार मतलब 100 लेकिन ग्राफिक नॉवल आई थिंक इट्स द फर्स्ट टाइम इट हैज बीन क्रिएटेड एज ए बायोग्राफी और एज ए नॉवल। So whichever way was accepted. So I think Suraj will be able to explain it more. So I invite Dr. Suraj, our Navy scholar, for presenting us this craft, this art, and
thank you. Thank you so much, and really thank the organizers of this event, Shruti Vijay Naine, and of course Professor CHAMANLAL, who I'm so junior, but thank you so much for thinking of me and inviting me today. And my own discipline of art history, which I teach at the School of Arts and Aesthetics in JNU, compels me to begin today with an overview of the graphic novel or comic form. Now there's always a debate that what is the difference between comics and graphic novels? Is it simply economics? That comics are cheap and railway station deliveries, and graphic novels are more expensive, so they partake a more elite version. We can look at that as a debate or suspend it and just look at what we have today as text and its form, which both the comic and the graphic novel actually share. So somewhere a lot of the graphic novelists of India, like Olivier Sen and all, have said that they don't think they make anything other than a comic. They make comics, and that actually makes it accessible for its humor and for its content to not only different people, in terms of class groups, and also age groups. So I'll begin by talking about the comic form in quite detail, and I hope you enjoy it because all of us have read comics. It should be something. I'm not a Bhagat Singh expert, so I will come to the book and how I feel it looks work as a deeper history that is arriving on the scene. The graphic novel form. What kind of narrative has it actually meant to? How is it something that she has chosen for Bhagat Singh's story? And after all the publications as mentioned on Bhagat Singh, why is it necessary to have a graphic novel? So I look at the history of the graphic novel and comic form with some technical aspects also, and I'm very excited to see this kind of visual response. I mean, we have filmmakers, we have sirs, they just put in all the photographs and the archive photographs. This kind of interaction between people what sir was mentioning about photographs being drawn on the body. What does it mean to have a photograph of a leader, of somebody who inspires you, and look afterwards? And therefore, is this kind of visual response something that has a history, a deeper meaning than just picking up a comic meaning? Perhaps it's the really thing, perhaps it's the really understand any. So, I'm just going to begin, and hope you can see the connections. The comics are easy to recognize, but they're very difficult to define. Will Eisner, the great exponent on comic theory from the US, so comics actually originated in the US as a subculture. They were very cheap, they were almost free, they were just photocopied and distributed to people, and they were very anti-establishment. And he uses the term sequential art, describing the format of the comic book as a montage of word and image, requiring the reader to exercise both verbal and aesthetic interpretive skills. The regimen of art, that painting as we know it, brushstroke, symmetry, perspective, as well as the literature, which is the other part, plot, grammar, syntax, they become superimposed on each other in the graphic novel, making the act of reading a comic an intellectual pursuit as well as an aesthetic practice. What is that joy that we feel when we see a comic book? It's an aesthetic experience. It's not just reading, it is also looking. Further, Scott McCloud later modifies this definition. He says, to juxtapose pictorial and other images in a deliberate sequence. So sequence is very important. The focus is now moved from aesthetic and the intellectual to defining elements of a sequence, a string of images that are read one after the other to produce meaning. Now, comics need not incorporate text and differ from a cartoon by producing a more complex pattern through sequential and spatial arrangement. So, again, that's another category that we feel a little confused about from a cartoon story. This may sound very complicated to explain, if you're just looking simple Calvin and Hobbes script, why do we need to have these classifications? But they're there because the maker is sensitive to whether they're making comic or cartoon or graphic narrative. However, like abstraction actually moves away, and if you see the first strip, it moves away from both resemblance and meaning, which is coming in pornography. Like pornography, things look as they are, and in its extreme, it leads to the picture plane, a realm of pure shape, color, and line. Right? So our interpretation of something that is being depicted moves from a photographic to a minimal kind of linear depiction because of a certain kind of cultural education of seeing. How is it that we are able to interpret it so easily? Between the three vertices, the realistic then, iconic abstraction, and pure abstraction, we are looking at a map of every possible form of visual art and communication. And in this book, you'll find all of them. You'll find that whole range, moving from very literal depiction to very abstract depiction. Artists and communicators borrow elements from one, two, or all three of these. So the basic building block of comics are panels or single frames placed in a sequence. Now, panels commonly have rectangular borders, as you would notice, but they can take any shape or have no border at all, as long as it's clear where one ends and the next begins. Outside the border, there's a blank area known as a gutter. so that's the space in between. Panels have pictorial images of some sort, drawing, painting, photo, text, and a very wide variety, especially with digital media. It's become very easy to have very different kinds of elements over there. In fact, if you see how Hergé made Tintin, they were all hand drawn. Now with the digital, you have the option to superimpose different visual elements. How information is presented in comics is often as important as what that information is, because it leads you in terms of interpretation. The page layout and panel shape can be used to convey the dimensions of sound, emotional climate, in which the action occurs, as well as contributing to the atmosphere of the narrative. So sometimes we like read a word and we know it is a sound. So it is a multi-sensorial kind of experience when we read this kind of work. It's not just visual. Even a seemingly straightforward layout of uniform rectangles or squares is chosen by an artist to create an impression. It may be a way of focusing the reader's attention on the action rather than its depiction, or reinforce a theme of conformity, repetition, or boredom. Alternatively, there are artists like Chris Ware who create very ornate pages and panels in multiple directions to create a sense of complexity of personal history and memory. It's very difficult to enter a page like this. Where do I go? What do I look at first? How do I make a story? When we approach a page, we must ask these questions. How is it organized? Is the panel order obvious? Over here it is not obvious. I can look at the flowers first or the tree first, who knows? And are the borders of the uniform shape and size? And I think all these things, if we are aware before we approach the book, it will somewhere make sense to us a little more. If they are varied, how do they affect meaning? A comic's aesthetic style is probably the most difficult aspect of analyzing comics, since there are so few guidelines for different types of drawing. Who is actually teaching us this? Are graphic artists trained in this style? Or is it something that they evolve after they do other fine art practices and then they come here? India doesn't really have that kind of institutional training. Over here it is really something where an artist or a bookmaker will venture out of their own interest and curiosity. Now, the terminology of film studies is often used to describe the basic features of an image. So you have long shots, close up or zoom, and because there is a strange kind of relationship of staticness and mobility in these comics. There are things which are just static, because you're obviously looking at a drawing that you can look at again and again, but it's also moving in a narrative. So you can imagine that there is a story that is in motion. You turn pages in a certain way and that kind of thing happens. We can look at also factors such as the color palette used, whether the style is cartoonish, abstract, photorealist. Those are also stylistic choices. Right? Again, very difficult to enter this kind of work, and that perhaps is the intention of the maker. That the visual realm can be very chaotic. So here it is being presented in all its chaos to you, to confuse you, rather than sort things out. So is it cartoonish, abstract, photorealist? What are the words being depicted? Are there backgrounds, and if so, are they detailed or schematic? Does the plane of vision remain constant, or does it vary? And does the art draw your attention to a particular action? So comics do not have to include text, but many do. Text could be in the form of dialogue, narration, sound effects, commentary, clarification, image, and more. Context, however, is key, since you often can't tell what a piece of text is doing on a page without determining how it's related to the images it accompanies. And somewhere this very new, simple, or marginal kind of art, which is the graphic art, addresses a very important problem in the visual and literary worlds, which is the image-text relationship. Would you call this an artwork, or would you call it a book? It doesn't belong to literature, does it belong to art history and the fine arts? That kind of disciplinary separation becomes very difficult. Maybe it's not necessary. But you have an analysis for both ends. You have graphic novels taught in art history as well as literature departments. Now, without any text, as it would be difficult to draw a connection between three panels of Aparajita Nayan's A Gardener in Wasteland. With the text, the panels develop an interplay of different elements. I'll come back to this text as an important publication on current rights and a biography of Pule. The text boxes convey a narrative voice, providing not only information on the location and time of the action, but also the opinion of the narrator. So here, the narrator can really place himself or herself as being an important part of how the story is being spoken about, because you see a difference in the type of boxes, which are dialogue boxes and narrator boxes. We are very used to seeing these things and we don't separate them. But you know when the narrator is telling you something about the next scene, like it's the next day or 2 years later, and then there are dialogue boxes which are separate. So you will see, also words which have sound effect. The word bang is used to convey sound. Another example is the use of text as a non-verbal device. So you have question marks and exclamations, punctuations like that, which have a certain emotive quality. And are interpreted as symbols through a language system you already know. And despite that medium's potential for complex narratives, comics have always been considered a low art, catering to an infantile reader base, although the French disagree and they call it the ninth art. Of late, it has garnered attention as an art form from academics, media, critics, readers, although it hasn't reached the barriers of the conventional art scene. So if we go to a museum or a gallery, we have this kind of art that is there on the walls that actually have that kind of financial value also. Is it going to be bought and sold like expensive painting? Probably not. Although I must say, in the Amritsar Museum, the main illustrator for the walls is Bhagat Singh, who is India's foremost graphic novel artist. Right? Many comic artists, especially in India, remember the act of reading comics as one done in secrecy, away from the eyes of disapproving parents and teachers. And we've always done that, reading comics in secret. But what created this hegemony in the first place, this hierarchy between literary forms, between art forms? Dr. Frederick Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent, Studio System of Work, Roy Lichtenstein's comics, are all of these ubiquitously considered art. By the 1980s, comics not only expanded as an industry but transformed, and we know that manga comics in Japan and so on became cultural emblems of certain places in the world. Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which actually won the Pulitzer Prize for literature. It is a really evocative narrative of the Holocaust, and it became like exemplary of where graphic novels can actually impact the world. There's also in India Indrejal Comics that launched Hamachitra, which is something we are all very familiar with, and I'll come back to in the detail. Comics are on the fringe of art and on the fringe of literature, which is great. Who wants to be in art and who wants to be in literature? The time has come for the graphic novel to be looked into from outside the parameters of literature, outside the parameters of art. This is a quote by Sarnath Banerjee, who is also one of the leading and foremost graphic novelists. And there was a wonderful volume that came out by Mars magazine, which is art history's main journal or magazine for us in the country, on comics. So Banerjee had contributed to it, and this is what he said. There is a Dr. Frederick Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent, which is a very interesting document. It's written in 1954, and it's the most debilitating attack on comic books that shaped public perception. He said, the document blamed comic books for juvenile delinquency. They said if you read comics, you're going to be deranged, you're going to do bad things in society, branding comics as a genre that only appeal to baser emotions linked to sex and violence, and that kind of, aimed at young adults to make them wayward and all of that. So there was a lot of conservatism towards comics. And the industry always relied heavily on a system of production that required teams of artists, writers, pencilers, colorists, and not a lot of money was initially over there because it was actually banned. A lot of schools and libraries banned the use of comics. It's important to also look at the figure of Roy Lichtenstein for his first successful appropriation of comic images by the art world during the pop art movement of the 1960s. And that kind of reproduction of the pixelated, printed kind of look which Lichtenstein became very famous for. He was also, especially known for his use of images from comic book panels drawn by other artists. So there is an appropriation going on, which is some kind of artistic license in this form. This kind of borrowing from mainstream media that is possible. Now, there are also other narratives who feel that India didn't have a culture of vision, text, and orality meeting together would be inaccurate. And I just want to draw this other more indigenous strain which does inform a lot of graphic novel productions now. So these are performance-based visual narrative forms that emerged maybe 400 years ago in India. The sources for the narratives are customarily of a certain religious or darshanic nature of the Mahabharata, Ramayana, local legends. Significantly, what is common among these is also what distinguishes each from comics, since they combine image and the spoken and not the written word. So, oral narrations and images have a greater, deeper history in our context. So, comic image and word are both represented graphically, while these storytellers perform images through oral narration and song. So, examples are many, including Patachitra from West Bengal, Chitrakati from Maharashtra, Togalu Kopayana from Karnataka, and Kawad from Rajasthan. And this is something we are all very familiar with. Of course, with the market, that kind of association went away. You can buy a butter scroll without having to do anything with the oral narration. You can pretty much see what the narrative is about. And that's it. But earlier, these were not things that were available in the market. That only came in the 19th century bazaar situation. These were not made for public consumption. They were only made for the fatwa by the singers. So we can trace visual narratives very far back in history. But as Origin Sen points out, the traditional forms involve a recounting of stories, whereas comics involve a visual enactment. It is interesting to note the difference in grammar and aesthetic gravity when one is recounting rather than enacting. Right? Recounting of myths, of histories, which are known to the public already, of that kind of epic narratives which are already known, such as the Ramayana and Mahabharata, versus a certain enactment of something that could be of a newer source, actually. Many graphic novels today adapt the traditional aesthetic to suit modern narratives. So you will see Tara books and Bluff publications and Ramayana are actually redefining the grammar of these storytelling mediums. So you will see perhaps a very modern story of something happening in Delhi being told through Madhubani. That kind of hybrid text that we see of traditional art forms being used to tell modern tales is something that is really a huge practice in the whole graphic media now. So new spaces for engagement between image and word have opened up, but at the same time we must ask what may be lost artistically in this process. Are these illustrations essentially meant for this format, or what are the compromises that are being done in terms of scale, in terms of medium, in terms of even the pace with which how the images succeed each other. So that is that kind of switch that we see when we see folk traditions actually being adapted to the graphic form. This is also in response to traditional patronage systems breaking down and practitioners increasingly being dependent on urban markets. they have to cater to the market because that traditional patronage has gone away. So it's about the question of their livelihood. So images on the butter have a polyphonic nature, means that different oralizations of the part will perhaps speak differently. It's not just one story. People will go faster or slower depending on their own narrative. In the Chitrakar mode of storytelling, unlike the graphic novel mode in which each story is broken down into many incidents, the action sequences are abbreviated with only the start and the climax of the sequence being depicted, often in the same frame. So we don't even have an opening out of the entire narrative scene by scene. That's just assumed in terms of cultural memory. So somewhere the context of the listeners is also very important. An author such as Ikru could have her work circulate everywhere in the world, but if we have someone locally producing a folk art form as a narrative, they don't know who is going to listen to it. So they know what assumptions they can make about the knowledge system that's already there. The performer relies on the lack of detail of the score to adapt and improvise the song. In a comic, the attention to detail drives the story forward. Now, Western comic culture had a great influence on India, so let's also talk about how colonial Indian cultural interaction shaped the form that we have today. The earliest of Western comics that can be traced back is to the Awadh Punch, late 19th century satirical magazine based on the British Punch. The most, I think it's a wonderful text actually, it's available on PDF online, so it's a entire book on the history of Punch that you can read. It's called the most enduring comic paper according to Partha Mitter, and the original was started by the British Dining Club in 1841, giving birth to the word cartoon. Punch stood for the tenets of Victorian respectability, and its Indian counterparts, the Delhi Punch, the Punjab Punch, the Urdu Punch, and more, were clearly an index of imperial mentality. The magazine included comic strips and cartoons, as well as poetry and essays from 1877 to 1936. From then on, India's tryst with comics fell to various regional publishers and strongholds in West Bengal and Mumbai in particular. The Times of India began producing Indrajal comics in 1964. So Indrajal comics actually published series like Mandrake and Phantom. We might be familiar with these from our own childhood. But there was only one series that really defined generations' interaction with the form by using mythology as an index of implicit and eternal scientificity, and that is Amar Chitra. And the dominant themes produced by comics from India is very interesting because they're not universal across the world. You will always have small town heroes, urban fetishism, law versus justice, countryside hideaways, criminals, class, caste, superheroes, supervillain, patriot, terrorists. These are very repetitive themes in the kind of comics we have. Now we see how the graphic novel on Bhagat Singh is therefore responding to a much older truth when we talk about the hero figure in the comic. As a practice that's already visually embedded in our society, has a longer history. The DU Professor Nandini Chandra, in her book on Amar Chitra Katha, actually writes on the theme of superheroes and the Nehruvian state in the comics of the period. We know that Amar Chitra Katha celebrated the mythological and historical hero figure such as Bhagat Singh himself by publishing a comic on him in 1981. Nandini Chandra says that in the 1970s and 80s there was a concerted effort to demystify, shrug off superstitions and fears to modify mythology so that it's adhered not only to the postmodernist interpretation of religion and spirituality, but so that it could be used in the process of constructing modern national subjects. So, very easily, we can see a national agenda for making the modern national subject in the medieval period, 70s, 80s, filtering into the graphic novel form. This is a very popular form, people are consuming it. So how do we make the right citizen who is aware of a certain kind of traditional history, who would also project as being someone who has a lot of patriotic feeling, It is done through this form, right? Shrugging off superstitions and fears, modifying mythology. So it has not only something of religion and spirituality, but a certain modernity and progress. So from Pi to Pran, obviously we know because of Chandra and so on. Many comic pioneers maintained that religion, if inserted, was used to provoke a rationalist, secular understanding of their presence. So here is a political intention. The modern is represented by unsentimental views of history, progress, and the need for advancement in technology, urbanization, and globalization. Now, in direct contrast to the usual superhero trope of dystopian metropolis, our heroes came from villages and small towns. Very familiar, Chacha Chaudhary begins his career in a village as a Punjabi Jat farmer. Bahadur is the son of Dr. Boyd in the Champar Valley, and in a series of inspectors from Indijal, there are many inspectors somehow in this comic narratives. Although they are Bombay-based, the protagonists are never too far of the village, from the village in their investigation. And that is sensitive to the fact that India, as an emerging nation, has a very, very deep connection with the rural, and the urban village doesn't exist without it. How do we understand that migration of the hero figure or the aspirational figure from rural to urban areas? It is through figures like this who will be able to speak the language of home and make that bridge, and give a sense of comfort to the readers who very often like the superheroes are displaced from small towns and villages in search of jobs and economic opportunities or education. The vision of modernity and the city is constructed from a rural, provincial kind of setup. In the comic I Spy, Nagraj and Tiranga, two of Raj's comics with the most significant heroes, grapple with the distinction between protectors or Rakshak and the slayers or Atankarta. So you can also see how this is shading into the concept of the hero, which Ikru of course has explored. When Tiranga is conflicted about personally doling out punishments, Nagraj points out that if these enemies were wounded and left to the state authorities, they would inevitably cause more trouble in the future, hence they had to be killed. So, how to actually justify killing by the hero. That's interesting because a lot of the cinema of the 1970s and 80s, Amitabh Bachchan and so on, the angry young man, why is it that they must kill the villain? It is, certain justification of righteousness, and also somewhere it's sensitive to the failure of the state in bringing these people to book. Somewhere, it is the anti-citizen who must do what is required in terms of bringing justice, which might be to people, because the state has not been able to actualize what the promises of citizenship were going to be at the time of the elections. So you see cinema and popular domain cinema, comic actually interacting deeply when it comes to narratives. The distinction between legal justice and personal reprisal is generalized as a difference between law and justice. Even as the state is progressing in terms of political and economic advancement, it is still fallible, and therefore the superhero is cast as a vigilante, bridging the gap between the law and the state and justice for its citizens. He is the one who will save you. This was the position of the revolutionaries during the struggle for independence in India. And Bhagat Singh's heroism is identified through the action that he took against the Raj in counter-aggressive. That the comic format in India already knew how to portray historic figures from mythology or fantasy before him. This is Ikru's graphic novel and a larger kind of visual history for us. Additional observations include the countryside that is represented in terms of loot, but not by mistake. The bad guys are always the dacoits. Generally, a native, as an Indian in appearance, they are found in the Chambal Valley or other rural hideouts. So, basically, how does violence or a certain kind of physical prowess get inscribed in certain characters in the narrative? The countryside is therefore acts as a conduit for criminal activity. We also reflect on some social biases in mainstream comics, as the most common rung of criminals are domestic servants or lower level employees of a different economic class. Even comic like Subanti and so on. Why is that figure always a kind of figure of humor? So there's a point. How do we actually look at these differences in society? The boy, the domestic servant, and somewhere bringing it into a sort of understanding of a very, very fraught social system. So the comics conveniently overlook this new dacoity in the valley not carried out by bloodthirsty Rajputs, but lower caste men and women seeking caste or caste revenge. So it's actually very sensitive to the hierarchies of caste and class that are there in society. Now the status of the superhero is always ambivalent. Is he a patriot? Is he an anarchist? Is he a renegade? And this is a question often posed to figures like Bhagat Singh, whose methods were not aligned with Gandhian or Nehruvian ideals of non-violence. Strangely, in these comics, supervillains are portrayed often with the same attributes as their hero counterparts. And they usually freedom fighters, whether they are fighting to free their people or to avenge some historical wrong. So there is very interestingly one would think that hero and villain belong to completely different categories. But when it comes to this kind of visual and textual characterization, we see so much similarity of iconography, of the elements, of the kind of emotional capacity that the hero and the villain can have, or say oppression, or a certain kind of vengefulness, or a certain sense of injustice. So it becomes very interesting, especially in figures of the revolutionaries about whom everybody doesn't agree. So the major difference is that the superhero's goal is to defend not just his own race, but all of humanity. In terms of violence versus justice, our villain and hero therefore mutually implicated. Now, briefly, I will also look at comic books as social tools, because I'm curious about where this text will go and how that will impact a certain social fabric. It's an important aspect of South Asian graphic literature, and hopefully help to define the possibilities that novels such as these and by other recent authors can build awareness and have an impact on society. So the World Comics Network and its Indian branch, the World Comics India WCI, that was established in the mid-90s, are at the heart of what they call the grassroots comics movement. And an inexpensive and uncomplicated medium through which issues of the silent majority in the country can be addressed. What distinguishes these comics is the ownership of the content as well as the stories. They're basically 4-panel comics created by members of the community and pasted onto various public locations, village meeting places, bus stops, offices, shops, schools, electricity poles, and trees. The WCI movement started in low literacy states in India, but found its success all over the country, breaking the myth that only low literacy areas will accept visual-oriented content. So this graphic mode actually became something that the government harnessed to communicate all sorts of social messages, whether it was about AIDS awareness or some new scheme for girls' education or something. This mode became a matter of communication of policy matters to the public. So it's interesting to see how the form maybe actually has a huge public impact, not only in low literacy places, because places of low literacy, because that was what was anticipated, places where too many people can't read, at least they have the image, that they kind of understand what's being said. But popularity of the visual medium is such that it worked everywhere. It worked everywhere to very quickly, succinctly communicate. If you see other government hoardings about, donate blood or anything, there is always that traffic element. Is it required? Yes, it is, because text will not draw attention entirely without the visual element. And it's in an explanatory sense also. Or for instance, something about dengue malaria that is. There will always be a panel of images or a series of images that will explain what has to be done. And it's very vast, that kind of social intervention that has been enabled by the graphic medium. Now, recently, 60 government school teachers and 30 districts of UP have shown how comics can be used in education. These teachers have been using grassroots comics as a teaching learning tool in their classrooms, thereby innovating innovatively breaking stereotypes attached to UP Bihar state schools. One of the teachers converted many of the complicated textbook chapters into comics, while others made over 20 comics on local issues to connect the villagers in the school. The larger point I'm trying to make is the practical implication of this genre, whether both through creation and reception can really impact society. Now, before I go into Inqilab Zindabad, the book that we are looking at today, I'm just going to look at other books that have closely, revolved around this kind of work brought out by publishers such as Yoda and Ramayana for actually forming a sub-genre. So it really sees that coming, and it's a millennial kind of phenomenon. It wasn't there before. It's relatively new. So there is, Aparajita Nayan's Gardener in the Wasteland by Ramayana that traces Jyotiba Phule's Flight to Liberty and is a commentary. There is also commentary on comics called No Laughing Matter by Unnamati Shyam Sundar, who's actually being a JNU student. There's First Hand, an anthology edited in 2 volumes by Vidyan Samani and Origin Sen. And the latter of whom Sen is also credited for publishing the first graphic novel in India, titled River of Stories on the Nardana movement. Now, First Hand, the one on the left, actually bears several stories of social import, how government policy and programs affect everyday lives of people, as well as the complex and varied forms that exclusion can take, specifically themes like health, water, sanitation, women at work, communal and ethnic violence, among other issues. In holding up a mirror to our times, this timely volume ends with narratives about 2 communities that have become the unsung survivors of exclusion in our country. So marginality is very central to the themes of these kind of books. So there's the Devdasis and the Jarawas of Andreas. They are featured in that in the book on the left, which is a non-fiction anthology. On the other hand, is a specific text in No Laughing Matter by Unnamati Shyam Sundar, a history like no other that asks you to consider what you are laughing at. It is actually a kind of subversive commentary on the idea of the comic. What is so funny? So in 2012, the inclusion of a 1949 cartoon by Shankar showing Jawaharlal Nehru whipping a snail-born B.R. Ambedkar in a school textbook evoked the protest, and a Savarna counter on the grounds of artistic freedom. Scholar and cartoonist Unnamati Shyam Sundar then undertook an archival survey of cartoons of Ambedkar in the English language press. The result is a collection of over 100 cartoons from India's leading publications drawn by Shankar, Enver Ahmed, R.K. Lakshman, among others, that may bear the perverse and thoughtless hostility Ambedkar often had to contend with. The incisional commentary woven around each cartoon in this book offers a veritable biography of a man historically wrong. Now, further in 1873, Phule wrote Gulamgiri, a scathing, witty attack on the Vedas as idle fantasies of the Brahman mind which enslaved the Shudras and Anti-Shudras. 140 years hence, Srividya Natarajan and Aparajita Nayan breathe fresh life into Phule's graphic imagination, and here we really see an affinity with the kind of work that Ikru Sandhu has done for this work. There's a weaving in the story of Savitri Bai, Jyotiba's partner in his struggles. In today's climate of intolerance, this is a manifesto of resistance, setting the dynamite of thought to the scriptures and ideas that Hindus hold dear. There is also Bhimayan. I don't have an image of Bhimayan, by the same publisher, authored by Srividya Natarajan and S. Anand, illustrated by Durgabai Vyam and Subhash Vyam, on the biography of Ambedkar. In this groundbreaking work, Pradhan Bond artists Durgabai Vyam and Subhash Vyam actually interweave historical events with contemporary incidents, infusing fresh energy into the graphic medium through their magic now. Right, so now let's just, I'm only going to do very, very brief look at this book because I felt like the kind of history that is opened up into the media and into our own kind of tendencies to visualize narratives is something that I wanted to focus on more. So let's move on to our book specifically. Its visual scheme, narrative layout, and one notices several things. Now, in the absence of anything more than 4 photographs of Bhagat Singh, as mentioned by the author and as Sir explained to me, this graphic novel is a welcome addition of visuals to the great martyr's life history. I mean, how do we visualize Bhagat Singh if there are only 4 photographs of him? The opening pages declare the shared regional roots of the author, Ekrup Sandhu and Bhagat Singh, both of whom actually belong to the Majha region of Punjab. The book follows a biography of Bhagat Singh, locating his politics in a family of active participants in the freedom struggle. And you'll see that the author's format oscillates between all historical factuality. This is page, I think, 22. Where you see the kind of architectural detail and almost resembling a company school painting with the white spare background and the work even with the shadows of the figures in the foreground. Very, very schematic somewhere in its reference. So there's historical factuality, and this is also similarly, some kind of reference to the way painterly renditions would have been done. So there is perspective, there is foreground, background, and a sense of the depth and space of the page. Full page, actually, visuals. These are all full page illustrations. And then, images like this, where there is a more introspective analysis into the mind of the protagonist and the decisions that he took, the tensions that he faced, assisted by abstract visual elements in several pages. The narrative is also punctuated by contemporary references. I don't think I have an image of that, but the cessation of the 500 rupee notes in the government's move to demonetization bears an illustration of the Dandi March that comes out in Bhagat Singh's own political reference. So there's jumping of time, very interestingly. And certain complexities become easier to understand due to the amenable visual layout, such as the progressive impact of studies on Bhagat Singh's political choices. So that part is really actually opened out, slowed down. What did Bhagat Singh read? What did he study? How did his mind open into becoming somebody who thought the way he did and take the necessary political action? And his exposure to various pedagogies, different teachers, his gradual adoption of atheism, and all of this may not have, perhaps appeal to a younger reader in the same way if it was just one title after another, but when it is in illustration, there is a different kind of power of reception. And we get a keen glimpse into Bhagat Singh's political companions, Azad, Nikita, Rajguru, or the other people around him, into their personalities, anecdotal information on the relationships they shared, besides a larger, well-known narrative of their lives. We know from school what they did and everything, but what was the kind of relationship they shared? And how did they think together? How did they come together? That kind of visual enactment that is made possible is something that really stays in my mind. I keep looking at my own example of how in middle school, never learning which book of theme came after the other. I only learned it when I went to JNU at the School of Arts and Aesthetics for an MA, and I knew them by the kind of paintings that they commissioned. So how was Akbar different from Jahangir? I knew through the painting. I actually never knew the sequence till I'd seen the Akbar. So particular interest I thought personally in the book was this very detailed chapter on the trials, the chapter 4, which again would have been very difficult given that there is so much detail. She hasn't skipped over any detail. And that balances the physically tortured state of the revolutionaries in prison. And so there is this kind of humanitarian concern as well. What did they actually physically go through? What were they tortured about? And how do we actually visualize them going through it? And the clinical nature of the court of law. And something like this is obviously a more metaphorical reference. There is also a sense of agony in these figures, in these images. And in the final pages of the book, there is the title that reappears. and it evocatively kind of brings the resonant cries at the times of Bhagat Singh's hanging. So there is a very palpable sense of the energy that would have been evoked at a moment like this. And there's several illustrations of that moment, essentially. And of course, the kind of choice of using only black and white for this kind of work to be impactful, also to have a historical reference, contemporary color, historical black and white. You know, we also have that kind of photographic association of something existing in black and white because at that time there was no color photography. So that kind of association is actually informing, I think, the group's aesthetic choices. Now, my final comments of the book actually remain an appreciation of visual engagement with a politically powerful yet poignant theme, exploring not only historical facts but also personal details of the man behind the name Bhagat Singh. On his anniversary today, this is a fitting tribute to his memory. One hopes that the graphic format reaches newer, more diverse audiences, and they could deep dive into the life of one of India's most important historical figures. So that's actually what I have to say today, but I'm happy if there's a wider discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Surendra, for your excellent presentation. You brought the background of visual arts. और मैं बात कर लेता हूँ कि अमर चित्रकथा बहुत पुरानी चल रही है। वो हिंदी के साथ अंग्रेजी भी शुरू कर दिया। वो एक किताब का टाइटल यहाँ दिखाया था, शायद आपका भी एक हफ्ता होकर रखी हो। तो ये नए सिरे से एक नया फॉर्म, किसी न किसी तरीके से एक फॉर्म की डेवलपमेंट है। अभी जो वेस्ट में ज़्यादा पॉपुलर हो रहा है और उसका चित्र जो है, चित्र तो रहे हैं हमेशा और चित्रों में कहानी भी कही जाती है। अब सवाल ये है कि ग्राफिक आर्ट और पुराना चित्र आर्ट में तो उसमें एक तो लिंकेज का उसी की डेवलपमेंट है, उसी की इम्प्रूवमेंट है या उससे कुछ अलग है। तो ये चीज़ें हैं क्योंकि वेस्टर्न में अपने ढंग से विकसित की है। तो हमारे यहाँ भी नेचुरली हर जगह का अपना कल्चरल फॉर्मेट जो है उसमें शामिल होता है। तो मेरे ख्याल में हम लोग थोड़ा इस पर चर्चा कर सकते हैं। मैं भी कुछ कह सकता हूँ, लेकिन मेरे से पहले मैं डॉक्टर अमर फारूकी से चाहूँगा कि वो थोड़ा सा इसकी शुरुआत करें। डॉक्टर अमर फारूकी दिल्ली यूनिवर्सिटी से रिटायर हुए हैं अभी हाल में ही और बहुत वेल नोन हिस्टोरियन और इनकी सब किताबें बहुत।
थैंक यू। Thank you for taking us through the sort of history and of comics, of graphic novel, and we have looked at his form. I was just sort of thinking of, and I think group has really, this is a kind of pioneering effort which group has made. This is just, I mean, it's more of a comment. When, as a child, I recall that I used to, there used to be this series, I don't know whether it's available any longer, these used to be called illustrated classics. And I was very fond of going through those illustrated classics, both for the visual as well as, on learn the stories. We didn't have to go to a novel. We could put or play and we would learn. But I was always sort of told that this is something really, really sort of say lowbrow, as you were saying, juvenile, because that was the understanding which teachers had, which parents had. But I think what I was struck by when I was looking at Group's was that there is a certain kind of proportion that needs to be maintained between the text and the visual. And the moment the text gets sort of larger, and that's the point about the illustrated classics also, that those classics, the text is the more important thing rather than the visual. And I was just wondering whether the distinction you started off with, the comic and the graphic novel, whether it's to do with the relationship between the text and the visual in terms of the proportion of text to visual.
I think I can just speak. I think it's a very it's a choice that the author makes, and there are several graphic novels that have no text at all. And would they then be considered lowbrow? Maybe not. And maybe said, yeah. So I think there's arguments on both sides of the line. What would a teacher or a parent approve of? Something that has a lot of text, something that has a certain quality of language also, not colloquial kind of language, but something that's a little more refined, which is why Amar Chitrakatha also was considered a little better than diamond comics, and one would parents would buy that and not that. So there is that, the quality of language, but the proportion essentially, I think there are graphic novels of a certain kind which do not use text at all also. And there the kind of focus on the artwork is huge. It's just about decoding in a certain way your own bringing in your own interpretation of the visuals. But again, that's tricky because I think somewhere it is looking at a certain kind of audience that would already be familiar with a certain linguistic. So manga comics from Japan, essentially, they don't use so much text very often. It's all visuals, one after the other. I would need a certain kind of cultural understanding to be able to be visually that kind of work. So I think it really depends. I think it's graphic novels especially are pitched at a certain level, it's an accusation also because it's an elite medium. It's not necessarily this one, but the earlier publications that were coming and even now, which are not only expensive to buy but have a certain kind of cultural reference which is not accessible to everybody, unlike the comic. Is an issue. It's an issue, and the proportion of text in image does play a role in that. Okay. Who is the reader and how is selected that reader? I will also always be very interested in the teaching charts that are used in schools, and there is work on it by Deepika and others. It's called Ideal Boy, that book, on teaching charts. And there the kind of emphasis on the image is really there. It doesn't have much text because it is it's being used to look at students who are not originally readers at all. They're so young, or they don't have the skills yet. So again, if it's a teaching chart of just akshars, or if it is about good habits or flowers in your surrounding, there is no text essentially apart from the labels or something like that. So I think it varies according to the sensitivity to the audience as to who it's meant for. What kind of reader person can you? Like this book has so much text in it. It is obviously a very thorough history of the man and his life and everything that was going on around him. And the visuals actually open out that kind of text. It is something that makes it so much more alive in a certain sense. So again, it is meant for people who perhaps go back and forth between visual and text, and maybe be drawn to the text through the visual also, because it will make it more interactive, a little more easy to understand, and entry point.
Thank you.
I was just wondering that now that we're in the digital age, how will all this be transformed? And how can we convey the stories? You know, how will we use the visual medium to convey stories of, let's say, the freedom fighters in the digital age, using animation and all the special effects which are available in this.
Animation is a really big industry now, whether it is for historical figures or mythological ones. I know my children watch they know all the Indian epics and myths through animation. Things that I didn't know at their age, they know because Bhim and Hanuman and everybody has those animated series. So there is somewhere a dissemination of a cultural historical past through those kinds of productions which are very popular. But specifically to do with the graphic novel, I think production becomes much easier with the digital. Every page doesn't have to be hand-drawn, and so many more people with perhaps different kinds of skill sets can still do it digitally. There's also an inter-visual interaction between different media. The same manga comic has often inspired films. So it's very interesting that it isn't like there was a film and then someone made a comic which would be the usual way. One would think the comic has inspired the scenography of the film. Because of the way it unrolled in the comic, they would pace it like that and actually make a film. So there's a reverse impact as well. And that kind of translation between media, I think, is possible because of the digital media. I think somewhere there is still the sanctity or the desire or the artistic quality of the hand, which is something that you always look for. I mean, Nicole's work is like that. She's a master who, she sketches so beautifully. But what she perhaps does with that sketch at the second stage, maybe given a certain background color or a context or something, how would this page be, the cover actually be designed? It is the coming together of the hand and the computer in these ways, which we don't always separate. Only the maker would really know what has been done by hand and what is being done digitally. But it is a very important kind of domain that needs to be explored, this influence of the digital on something that was earlier only a hand covering it.
कोई स्टूडेंट anyone from our
It's just a question.
Thank you, sir. As ma'am earlier said that all of these separate pages of comics, graphic novels are also part of the commodity economy. They are producing to be sold in the market. So does this impact like in case of historiography, and especially now we know the reactionary forces who have taken control now, and even more than that, you mentioned Amar Chitragatha. I am familiar that the publisher of Amar Chitragatha was not exactly a progressive person. So does this, in that way, does this impact the accuracy of that work? As we know, Bhagat Singh was a leftist. So I am not sure, but maybe the Amar Chitragatha comic won't depict him as such. And nowadays, I'm from Bhopal. So the MP of Bhopal, I'm sure you all know her. So she posts images of Bhagat Singh in her propaganda, as if that's what Bhagat Singh stood for. So in these circumstances, there must be many let's just call it inaccuracies for now. So how do we counter that? Because if there is any anti-establishment kind of publication, then surely it won't have the resources and the time and many of these other issues which covers them. So how do we counter that? And I think Sir also mentioned this that nowadays like digitalization is growing, but like normal I don't think digitalization is cheap enough to be done by more effectively done by us. Like it's going to be something which is going to be hijacked by those who are already in the establishment. And you mentioned Bhim and Hanuman and all that. Like, and I'm pretty sure during the 80s there were many completely Hindu-based religious TV shows. They actually cultivated an entire generation of Hindutvaadis in some ways. So, in what ways can we counter that in order to promote what Bhagat Singh actually stood for?
Well, I think it's I think the graphic form, or what I usually look at, the popular domain of where graphic novels, comics, printed posters, advertising, all these kind of art forms that I teach. I don't teach mainstream art history of painting, architecture, sculpture. I look at this, what is circulating in the market, what is the everyday person consuming, not some fancy art gallery or museum. And the more I've looked at it for many years, the more I realize is there will never be a single narrative. There will always be positions and counter-positions, and whether if you have a Hindutva kind of representation, you will have a leftist representation, and a kind of appropriation, especially of heroic figures, especially of leaders. I mean, we can say, okay, Gandhi and Congress, but then look at his adoption in the Swachh Bharat movement, the graphic media, the classes and all there. So I think this is a domain where this kind of contestation of appropriation for a certain kind of agenda can be done. We cannot say that this person only belongs to a certain political orientation, so it can never be taken up by anybody else. You see, because their justification of why Bhagat Singh will speak in a certain way to the MP of Madhya Pradesh is their justification. It is entirely up to them to make those mythological or historical or imagined connections. You see a lot of the kind of poster work done for Bharat Mata at a certain time in the 20th century for India, early 20th, late 19th century. Again, very, very interesting, because you will want to question what is going on over here. How is Bharat Mata have become Bharat Mata of everybody? We are not even a united country as yet. How is she bringing together everybody through her kind of feminine, maternal kind of presence? She's also bringing a certain kind of secular state into being, because the Muslim, the Hindu, the Sikh, everybody seemed to be worshipping her, whether they did it actually or not. This is a space for fictionalization. So rather than perhaps thinking how do we counter it or having that kind of anxiety, which I acknowledge it's there, perhaps it's enough to look at the diversity and imagine the potentials of a medium that can do this, that can speak to so many different kinds of voices. So that polyphony type of thing, that Bhagat Singh is somebody whose history, whose presence is open for interpretation or appropriation for so many different. As a scholar, that is of interest. Somewhere I don't think we can take ethical positions with regard to, okay, is this right, is this wrong, if this is not okay. If it's not okay, that dialogue is always open. And also having an anxiety towards Hindutva, I realize this because I teach it as well. Because the kind of visual use of media done by the Hindutva is fantastic, I have to say. They use it very effectively. Whether we agree with that kind of investment or not is up to you, if that is your personal judgment. Look at the way that the visual medium is being used, whether it was the Rath Yatra, whether it was the Prime Minister's election campaign, the harnessing of technology, from print to holograms to all sorts of different kinds of media technologies is also very interesting to explore. So I think I usually am fascinated by exploration. I have students of every political orientation in my class, for instance, who would love to debate among themselves, but that is what I want them to bring to class. Talk about how perhaps the same topic can be so differently interpreted by people who have very different affiliations, the same figure of interpretation. Gandhi is a great example. I mean, he exists across the stratum, per se. So I hope that somewhere opens up your question rather than answering it. It just opens up the question to deal with our own dilemmas of, how does my position speak to this? You might feel extreme patriotism or revulsion or any of those feelings, but to bring them on the table, and actually think about, why am I feeling the way I am when I look at something that's contrary to so-called history? Is this a space that can allow fictionalization, and why? That is interesting. This is the kind of thing that historical figures like Bhagat Singh can allow, Gandhi can allow. Certain kind of reinterpretation of quality and value. There is no analysis of whether a truth is historically एकदम accurate. Maybe Sir will find 10 things that she's not done accurately. But somewhere an interpretive quality is allowed for that kind of reinterpretation to take place, especially as we go down the line in terms of time. The more the time elapses, the more this kind of thing will open up in terms of the capacity to be reinterpreted.
Thank you for the lecture. I wanted to give a feedback on this theme. I'm working on Amar Chitra. I work on Amar Chitra, and I found that if you read the biography of Anand Pai and Pran Kumar Sharma, so there is a lot of Pran Kumar Sharma never talked about the religion. He never worked on religion. He came from the Pakistan. He was also a victim of the violence. So he wanted to spread humor in the life of the people. So he never worked on religious themes. But on the other side, when you talk about Anand Pai and you read the biography, Amar Chitra also being her biography in its format. So you'll find he's a very religious man and he wanted to work on the religion and wanted to disseminate the idea about the culture. Later he brings some comments on the historical theme also. But the problem is that comments was written in 1970s and 80s. There is a lot of research happened after that. But still they are bringing the same kind of narrative in the history. You will see that the Muslims are weak and Rajputs are very martial form. So these are the problems in the comments. So another thing I wanted to ask you, this is my question, that I have a problem with the theme of the superhero. Because when you talk about the superheroism, then it's a kind of hierarchy, that one powerful person and one weak person. So what's your take on the concept of superheroism, where the superhero comes and rescue the other people, the common people? So somehow it's maintaining a kind of social structure. So I want your view on that.
Right, Amar Chitra Katha has actually been critiqued a lot by scholarship in humanities. Amar Chitra Katha isn't something that's allowed to just be. So everybody's actually brought up the exact same points as you have about a certain kind of inclination in faith and moral position that is there in Amar Chitra Katha. There's also a lot of work on how women are depicted in a very typical way, overly sexualized and overly always fair-skinned. And what is this? Why is this so hierarchical? And all that is over there. And a lot of the work that is coming out now is a counter to Amar Chitra Katha. Actually, in the way, say, women are being depicted by women authors of graphic novels are counter to the way in which we've been educated to see women in the graphic form in Amar Chitra Katha. So that kind of thing is there, and as an important kind of document of our time, Amar Chitra Katha reflected social biases. It was not one man's imagination. It was something that was already there in society. So perhaps it is us that we need to look at critically to say what is it that generated Amar Chitra Katha. It was very popular. The thing is, we may not agree. what it's doing because we have a certain education or because we have a certain critical standpoint, but it is something that's sold and it still sells. Why is it that people still agree to swallow that kind of, or take that history? Because, somewhere those biases are not being contested. Except in newer genres like graphic novels now, on Jyotiba Phule, on Ambedkar, on marginalized figures and their histories. So there is a talk back. It is coming very late, 1970s, 80s, now we are in the 2020s, it is very late. But somewhere we need to analyze what kind of society it is reflecting and is also feeding. Now the figure of the superhero is something that's open in terms of definition for me. Because now with works like this, Phule, is he actually a superhero kind of figure? But this kind of narrativization makes him so. So even if it's, these superheroes of mythology, whether it's our Ram or whether it's, the Spider-Man kind of person who has always been there in a comic, is it not possible to make a counter superhero? Women again. What about these women who have taken center stage in a lot of graphic narratives, who really are heroic figures, who are really people who are breaking the mold, who are actually making a certain presence of the feminine being felt, and how are they breaking from the ideal as well? In first hand, in other novels such as Kari and so on, you see kind of challenges to molded notions of identity of every sort. So this is the kind of position these texts are coming from. So I would say that your concerns with these very, very fixed tropes of superheroes and what Amar Chitrikatha has been feeding us are very real. But now there is a counterculture as well. And their reality is actually a reflection of our own biases. Always. So, it is us that we need to critique as well, not only the makers of Amar Chitrikatha. How is it that they got by so many years by showing these very typical kind of people, superheroes and heroines looking a certain fair, whatever way, which is so unrealistic. We believed in it. We believed in the notion of the superhero. For a certain, the 70s, 80s, I discussed, why was it important to have the heroic figure? Because it was the failed citizen who was being actually evoked. The citizen who was promised certain rights and powers in society at the time of independence by the 70s was a disappointed person. So the citizen coming somewhere for justice as opposed to law, as setting norms right, made a different kind of anti-hero. Right? All of cinema with Bachchan and everybody was that kind of figure. So different periods again have their own kind of heroic figures depending on whatever's going on in society. Right now we want people from the margins, because what about their stories? So you'll obviously see sexual minorities, caste minorities being really central characters to a lot of the publications coming now. So the figure of the hero now is very different from what we want from the
Any more comment, question? हमारे बीच नेताजी सुभाष की आज़ादी फौज के स्वतंत्रता सेनानी के परिवार से लोग पहुंचे हैं। कल इनके गणेश जी के पिताजी माधव जी 97-98 ईयर के हैं, तो उन्होंने वहाँ स्टेडियम में कदम कदम बढ़ाया जब नेताजी का और आज़ादी फौज का अभी भी उसी जोश से गाना सुनाया जिस जोश से युवा सुना था। थोड़ा लेट हो गए हैं तो मैं शायद अब आखिरी बातें करूँ आपसे। ये नावल और इस फंक्शन की तैयारी में और बहुत सारी चीज़ों में इतना वक्त लग रहा था कि कल रात को जाग के मैंने ये नावल पूरा पढ़ा, नावल और बायोग्राफी जो भी इसको कही। आई थिंक मैं तो शायद इसको बायोग्राफी, व्हाट इज योर ओपिनियन अबाउट ग्राफिक बायोग्राफी? फ्रंट टाइटल लिखा है, लेकिन पब्लिशर ने इसको नावल के रूप में भी कहा। एनीवे, ये तो फॉर्म की कंटेस्टेशन है। बेसिक चीज मैं आपको सबसे पहले ये कहना चाहता हूँ कि जो इम्पैक्ट विजुअल का है, इन पर्टिकुलर विजुअल के साथ साउंड को मिला के, वो इम्पैक्ट कई बार पढ़ते हम आम से ही, प्रिंट को पढ़ते हम आम से ही, और प्रिंट में ही जो आर्ट मिक्स होता है, कई बार विजुअल आर्ट मिक्स होता है, वो पेंटिंग हो या कोई और फॉर्म हो, तो दैट इंक्रीजेस इट्स इम्पैक्ट। एक सिंपल सी उदाहरण दूं आपको कि भगत सिंह के बारे में हम हिस्ट्री के रूप में जितनी चाहे तथ्यात्मक बातें कहें, कुछ उनके विचारों की बात करें, लेकिन जितना शहीद फिल्म ने, मनोज कुमार की शहीद फिल्म ने लोगों को भगत सिंह के बारे में सबसे ज्यादा मिला, बाद में उससे कुछ अच्छी फिल्में भी बनी हुई हिस्ट्री की सेंस में या फैक्ट की सेंस में, तो लेकिन शहीद ने जो म्यूजिक, उस म्यूजिक का इम्पैक्ट आज, यानी वहां पे विजुअल एंड साउंड दोनों मिले। मैं आपको एक दूसरी उदाहरण भी दे सकता हूँ थोड़ा सा। तमस नॉवल आप लोगों ने कहीं पढ़ा है, मैंने पढ़ा। जो तमस गोविंद निहालनी की फिल्म या टेली सीरियल करते हैं, जितना इम्पैक्ट उसका पड़ा, तमस नावल का प्रिंट में शायद उतना इम्पैक्ट नहीं पड़ा। मैं आपको एक और साधारण सी बात बताता हूँ कि बहुत बार मैं नावल का स्टूडेंट रहा हूँ, लेकिन नावल का शौकीन, फिल्मों का भी शौकीन, अपार्ट फ्रॉम अकेडमिक्स। बचपन से मैं देखता आया कि पढ़ते हुए, बहुत अच्छा नावल पढ़ते हुए गोदान पढ़ूंगा कुछ तरह से, तो शायद मेरी आंख से कभी आंसू न आया, लेकिन उसी चीज को जब मैं विजुअल के फॉर्म में देखा, मान लीजिए तमस की उदाहरण, तो तमस का वो जो सीन है जिसमें 22 औरतें कुएं में छलांग लगा के अपनी जान देते हैं, तो वो शायद आपको इतना घूम करेगा कि आपके आंखों में, सब लोगों का ऐसा नहीं होता, लेकिन बहुत सारे लोग हैं, मेरे साथ हो, मैंने लीगल साइड के प्रोफेसर है या क्या है, कई बार हम ओडी पर्सनैलिटी करते हैं, तो ओडी पर्सनैलिटी को छोड़ के बेसिक इमोशन के रूप में है, तो बेसिक इमोशन के रूप में वो चीजें इम्पैक्ट करती। अब इस नावल, इस ग्राफिक बायोग्राफी के बारे में थोड़ी सी बात हम करें। सुरेंद्र ने अंग्रेजी में बोला है, थोड़ा एकेडमिक उसमें बोला है, मैं आपको थोड़ा सा सरल या सादे उसमें बताना चाहूँगा कि पहले तो मैंने मेरा या सुरेंद्र जी का इस बात में, इसको पढ़ने में या इसको ग्रहण करने में दो अलग अलग परसेप्शन, मैंने इनका परसेप्शन एक आर्ट के तौर पे ये कैसे प्रेजेंट, मेरे परसेप्शन में आर्ट से ज्यादा, मैं भी चित्रों से थोड़ा बहुत प्रभावित हुआ होऊंगा, लेकिन मेरी ज्यादा आर्ट का हो मेरे दिमाग में वो है इसमें फैक्ट के गड़बड़ी है। फैक्ट्स के मेरे लिए जो है वो बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट है। कारण ये अभी जो आगामी बात की, एप्रोप्रिएशन इस वक्त जो है नेशनल हीरोज की, हर तरह के विचारों के लोग जो हीरोज, एक सबसे बड़ी चीज ये है कि जब पास्ट को सिर्फ इंटरप्रेट किया जा सकता, नोबडी कैन लिव इन द पास्ट, आप पास्ट में जाके लिव नहीं कर सकते, और लिव करते भी हैं तो वो आर्ट के लिए, जब हिस्ट्री पढ़ेंगे या नावल पढ़ेंगे या फिल्म देखेंगे, खुद तो उसको जी सकते, लेकिन जो खुद का जीना है उस मोमेंट का, उसको किसी ने कितना हद तक फैक्चुअल प्रेजेंट किया। ये हिस्ट्री वालों के लिए भी बहुत बड़ा सवाल होता है, और बहुत सारे हमारे जैसे लोगों के लिए भी, कि जो ये नहीं चाहते कि कोई चीज इस तरीके से पेश कर दी जाए जिसको पढ़कर लोग झूठी चीज हो या मिथ्यासिक चीज हो, और उसको मिथ्यासिक चीज को समझ के समाज में कुछ नुकसान है। मैंने सबसे बड़ी चिंता ये होती है कि बहुत सारी चीजें जो ऐतिहासिक रूप से तथ्यात्मक नहीं होती, फैक्चुअल नहीं होती, वो ऐसे कर दी जाती है। अभी आप सबने शायद कुछ लोगों ने हाल में सुधीर मिश्रा की फिल्म अफवाह, शायद आपने अगर नहीं देखी आप देखिए, अफवाह जो है वो आज के पूरे मौजूदा हालात में कैसे अफवाह फैला दी जाती है कि वहां पे एक ट्रक बीत नहीं जा रहा और बीच के द्वारा लोग भड़क जाते हैं, लोग दंगे होने की सिचुएशन बन जाती है। जबकि पता लगता है कि जब उस ट्रक को खोला जाता है तो उसमें गधे निकलते हैं 5-7 जिंदा रहते। बीच की बात तो छोड़ दीजिए, लेकिन उस अफवाह की वजह से पूरे समाज में दंगा होता है, इतना बड़ा दंगा हो जाता है कि बहुत सारे लोगों की जान जो है उसमें जा सकती है। तो मैं इसलिए हमारे लिए जो मॉडर्न में टेक्नोलॉजी की ऐसी डेवलपमेंट हुई है सोशल मीडिया की, जिसकी कभी किसी ने कल्पना नहीं। मुझे अभी थोड़ा सा याद है कि मेरे ख्याल में अब तो 20 साल हो गए मुझे, डॉक्टर दलजीत सिंह बहुत बड़े आई स्पेशलिस्ट थे अमृतसर, और अभी 2-3 साल पहले उनकी डेथ हो चुकी है। मैं उनका आंखों का मरीज भी था, लेकिन उनका दोस्त भी था। वो किताबें लिखते थे, वो पोएट्री लिखते थे, और वो मेरे साथ बैठ के बहुत सारी ऐसी चीजें करते थे। तो मेरे पास में बैठे बैठे वो कंप्यूटर पे बैठे कुछ कर रहे थे, चलो मैं तुम्हें एक चीज 5 मिनट के अंदर कंप्यूटर पे उन्होंने इतने शानदार तस्वीर बना के मुझे दिखाई, मैं दंग रह गया। जो हम पिक्चर ये अभी जिक्र किया कि इसको कैसे डिजिटल फॉर्म में ये बनाया गया है तस्वीर वगैरह से, तो वो 20 साल पहले कंप्यूटर में लोग इतने माहिर हो चुके थे तो उसमें एक डिजिटल आर्ट में एक डिजिटल तस्वीर थी। अब तो वो 20 साल के बाद इतना ज्यादा कि सोशल मीडिया और टेक्नोलॉजी डेवलप हो चुकी है कि अब इसके बारे में मैं एक थोड़ा सा बात करूँ। जैसे ह्यूमन डेवलपमेंट में जितनी चीजें ह्यूमैनिटी के भले के लिए कई बार डेवलप, साइंस की डेवलपमेंट मनुष्यता के मानवता के भले के लिए, इंसान की जिंदगी आसान